Good evening, everyone. I'm going to make a couple of announcements while we have some stragglers coming into the webinar. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our November webinar. I just wanted to make sure everyone's aware that there is also another webinar Thursday during the day, part of our Business of Arboriculture series. So if you're looking for CEUs, that's also a great opportunity. That will be Thursday at noon. And you can find out details on our website. It's all about job costing, so make sure to check that out. That is part of a series, Business of Arboriculture. It's designed for anyone who's interested in starting their own business, who maybe knows a little bit about being an arborist, but not necessarily about being a business owner. So it's a great series with a bunch of experts, so I hope you'll join us for that. We also have a couple of upcoming opportunities for additional learning. So there's a utility prep course that's coming up in December. That is with Randy Miller, who wrote the Utility Arborist book. And so he'll be going through that book chapter by chapter, much like we do the ISA exam prep course. We also have an ISA exam prep course coming up in Savannah in December. That's in person at Oatland. That's December 10th and 11th. So if you're looking to become a certified arborist, that's a great way to go through the exam prep book chapter by chapter with experts. So highly encourage that. I also opened up registration for our awards ceremony and winter workshop today. So that's a brand new offering. It will be January 11th at Amicalola Falls, and it's going to be a half-day workshop on management and topics, and then followed by an awards ceremony and dinner. So nominations are open. So if you know anyone who you feel like has excelled in the field this year, definitely nominate them for an award. We can't do awards without your input. So I hope that you'll check that out on our website and nominate somebody. You can nominate yourself or your coworker or your friend for an award. So definitely check that out. We're also offering the wildfire risk reduction qualification again in January. That's going to be January 8th and 9th in Rome, Georgia. So lots of upcoming opportunities to learn and meet in person. We'll have additional webinars coming up. So make sure to follow us on the socials and keep up to date with what's going on. Couple of quick housekeeping items. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A. I'll be monitoring throughout tonight's program for questions. So if they add to the conversation, we might ask them as they come in. And if there's a lot of questions, we might save them till the end, but I'll kind of gauge that as they come in. But feel free to ask your questions as they come up and just put those in the Q&A. The chat is really more for general chatter, and questions can sometimes get lost in there. So if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A. Also, if you're here for a CEU, there is one arborist CEU for this webinar, and I will put a survey link in the chat at the end of the presentation. So make sure you stick around for the whole presentation if you would like that credit. So I will be turning it over to Dr. Elizabeth McCarty now. Dr. Elizabeth McCarty is the Forest Health Specialist with the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. Her areas of specialization include forest entomology, insecticide use in trees, environmental risk of insecticides, and aquatic entomology. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Dr. McCarty. We're thrilled to have you with us.
Good evening. I'm glad to be here. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Before I get started into the presentation, I'd like to learn a little bit about the audience. So if you wouldn't mind, please put in the chat what area of arboriculture you or your company works in. That helps me know a little bit about the group I'm speaking to, and I can tailor the presentation to your needs. So I'll give it a minute for those to come in. And to fill the space, so this presentation was initially started between myself and Georgia Forestry Commission. We started pairing up to talk about southern pine beetle because we've been having southern pine beetle outbreaks in Georgia this year. And then we got hit by Hurricane Helene. So we've got two major issues going on. And hopefully we can continue to do these outreach materials and presentations to help professionals and landowners know their best options when they're responding. So I'm going to look through the comments. We've got residential, municipal, consulting, transplanting, fruit orchards, utility work, academics, tree service, consulting arborist. Okay, plan development. Awesome. Thank you so much for putting that information there. It helps me know a little bit about the group that I'm talking to. So try to view this if you don't own a stand of pine trees. This still applies to you. You may be in an area that was impacted by hurricanes in the residential areas. You may be an arborist in Atlanta and you didn't get hurricane damage, but you've had homeowners calling you about pine beetles, either our current ongoing southern pine beetle infestation or perhaps the IPs that we get every year. One of my most common phone calls as an extension specialist is IPs, beetles, and pine trees. And so this can offer something for you, even if it's a wide audience. So broad topic, insects and diseases post-hurricane, but again, find the information in here that fits for you. So an outline, I'll discuss an insect response, which is our greatest concern, and give a highlight of some of the pine insects that we expect we might see with hurricane damage, disease outbreaks, which are not as expected, and also perspective from myself as an outreach specialist, as well as Georgia Forestry Commission and the Florida Forest Service with what they saw after Hurricane Michael. And then some management recommendations. So you can see we're kind of giving it away. We'll be talking about pitch canker and some IPs. And if y'all are cutting into trees and the trees have beetles and the bark falls off, then you get to see some of this stuff. Hurricane Helene came into Georgia around Valdosta as a Category 2 storm. I've got some research sites out around here, and it is just torn up. GFC has estimated now that there is a $1.2 billion impact to forestry. That's billion. With around 1.5 million acres that receive the majority of the higher timber damage. That's a lot. That's a lot of impacts. That's a lot of trees on the ground are bent or broken. And that's a lot of people's livelihoods, especially with the larger trees when they've been building their stands for decades. Or if it's a homeowner, it's that house that they have loved the pine trees, their kids grew up with it, their grandkids play around them, and now the yard they're looking at is much different. And they just want to handle it the best way they can, and they want to be safe about it. So for comparison, on the left, we have Hurricane Michael timber damage. And the reason I mention Michael so much is we have not had the degree of timber damage since people really started recording this stuff with storms. There was Michael with $762 million of projected losses, and then Helene with 1.28 billion. Before that was Hurricane Hugo, and that was, I think, late 80s, early 90s. It came into South Carolina and caused a similar amount of timber damage. And so after Michael came through, UGA partnered with the Forestry Commission to do landowner workshops around the affected areas of the state. And we saw where there were knowledge gaps. I did some literature searches, and we really didn't have anything before Michael. And we still don't have a lot. So I'll provide what we think might happen. I will provide some answers, but I definitely do not have all of the answers. So stress pines and insects. So if the pine is broken and it's on the ground, like it's a dead pine tree, it's done. But we have a couple things going on. We have broken trees and that salvage operation. And then we have stressed trees that if you just walk up to it, the tree looks okay, but there's more going on under the surface. So when a tree is not doing well by storms, by compaction, by age, whatever, the breakdown process is facilitated by beetles. and then fungi. And that's a normal process. That's what's supposed to happen in the environment. That's where we don't have trees that are standing dead for hundreds of years. It's because we break those down, we get those nutrients back into the environment. That in itself is not a bad thing. But it's also habitat. When we have a bunch of broken dead trees or stressed trees, that's really good beetle habitat. And we have that in hurricane damaged stands, or if it's a tornado or any other kind of thing where we've had a big disturbance factor come in. But some of this is timing. A lot of times the debris, it's not going to be suitable for all of the different beetles all of the time. The phloem will dry out. And so if it's a late season storm like we had with Michael, like we have with Helene, that phloem tissue becomes unsuitable as it starts to dry out. And we also have a lot of the beetles kind of scaling back their life cycle. So we suspect, forest entomologists do, that if we had a big storm to damage, like if we had Hurricane Helene come through in July as opposed to, was it early October, late September, we'd be looking at different sets of circumstances and risks. That's what we suspect. We don't know because we haven't had those things happen that we can compare them. But some of this is going to depend. The debris may no longer be suitable for colonization, and so it would be timing dependent, and that may affect the scale of the insect infestations we see. This is really a damaged stress tree issue. If a stand is got 80% broken stems, it's just clear the slate. If a yard has all the pine trees down, you're just going to go in and get those trees out. The thing that landowners worry about is, will we have some kind of giant widespread epidemic on our healthy trees? Are the beetles going to come in and just wipe out everything? And we don't expect that. We expect that there will be some residual trees that are having a hard time, that are stressed. They might be more susceptible, but the degree to which that's going to happen, we don't know. So here is my high-tech visualization of what we expect in a storm. We're going to have some dead trees, maybe some debris piles, some standing stress trees, and then we have adjacent stands. And like, if we get beetles in this area here, how far might that go into the adjacent stand? If those trees are stressed, the risk would be higher. And what does that look like? But this is the landowner fear, that it's just going to wipe everything out. And again, based on our limited previous experience, we don't think it's going to happen to the degree that people fear. And so this part of it is maybe if you're talking to clients, depending on what their tree situation is to try to reduce their fear level. Give it some time. Let's see what happens. It doesn't necessarily mean that tree right next door is going to get attacked. Let's give it a little bit of time. So we don't want those knee-jerk fear reactions. That being said, we know that trees they're house smashers, especially the pine trees. And when a storm comes through, people see their neighbor's house get damaged, their neighbor's yard, and they want to start prophylactically cutting trees. And sometimes that's a good idea, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a great opportunity to talk to people about succession in their yard. And the tree that was planted there 80 years ago, sometimes it's not going to last 200 years. So what does that changing yard look like? So it really opens the door to a lot of conversations. And I say this as someone who cut 11 pine trees out of my yard last year. They were full of pitch canker. There were a lot of them that were leaning. It was somewhere that the house was put where it was never intended to have a house around the pine trees. And so based on my assessment of the risk of the condition of those trees and the massive pitch canker, I made the decision to cut trees. And I'm sure that you're having a lot of clients contact you wanting to make those kind of decisions. And so I operated from a knowledge base, and it wasn't a knee-jerk fear reaction, but for some people it is. And so this offers you an opportunity for education and to partner with them to make the right choices for their spot of land. There's a lot of right answers in this, but those answers can look different. So what beetles do we expect? We expect Ips engravers, and that is the beetle that we see most often in a variety of different situations. and they're the ones I suspect will come up now. Southern pine beetle, and I put a question mark around this. We don't have a history of southern pine beetle and hurricanes that we know of. If it's a heavily damaged stand and all that area is opened up, southern pine beetle really works by pheromone cues and having a nice dense stand where they can get that pheromone that they're going to cue in on. We don't really expect that with a lot of these storm damaged stands, but we also have SPB epidemics going on all over the state, and so we just have to see what that looks like. Black turpentine beetles, they usually come up, and then pine sawyers. And the timing of these will be just a little bit different sometimes. So IPS first, and this is, I get the most calls about this, and I bet that y'all probably do too. So there are 3 species of IPS in most of Georgia. There's a 4th species further up in the mountains. These typically have isolated occurrence unless there's a larger landscape level stressor. So like when we start getting droughts, then we start to see larger scale IPS infestations. They colonize stressed trees, branches, and slash. They are secondary, meaning that they are not causing the primary problem. Something has happened to make that tree susceptible. Then the IPS move in. It's sort of like watching National Geographic and the lion is stalking the herd of gazelles. It's not going for the fast ones. It's not going for the ones that are at their prime. It's going to go for the little ones that are weak. It's going to go for the ones that are sick. And it's going to take advantage of something that's already compromised. And that's essentially what all these secondary pests do. IPS has up to 10 generations a year, so they're going most of the year. They kind of slow down or go dormant during the summer, although I have taken bark off of a tree in North Florida in January and seen them still active. And again, secondary. If we see IPS, we should wonder why. And sometimes there's one thing that we can answer, like, here's the one thing. And everybody, they want to know, why did my tree die? What's the one thing? And sometimes we can't tell them what this one thing is. If it's right next to a new road that got cut and there was a lot of mechanical damage to trees, and that's an easy one to answer. But if it's that tree that's slowly been lingering in the yard with too much fertilizer applied and teenagers driving all over the roots and them getting hit by a lawnmower, there's a lot of things that contributed to the stress condition in the trees. So here's a picture of IPS tunneling in the tree, and I'll show this one again because it was a really cool picture to take. And then here's a picture of their backside. So they've got a spiky back end, and that is like the quick, yes, it is IPS. But we don't typically see the adult beetles very often. We're really looking at the outside of the tree for the signs of damage, and then perhaps pulling the bark off of the tree. So here is, this is IPS calligraphus gallery. And I like this picture because it really gives us a good view of what's going on. So there is a main chamber that the female is digging. The males will start and they'll have a nuptial chamber, which is a little bit bigger. And 1 to a few females will come in and mate with the male. Then they will start digging their own chambers. So the female digs her chamber and she goes along and lays eggs as she goes. And then once the eggs hatch, the larvae begin tunneling. So notice with these tunnels, as they extend from the main gallery, they're getting bigger. And they're getting bigger because the larvae are getting bigger. So if we think about under the bark of a tree, like being a two-way street, and water is moving from the roots, and I feel like I'm maybe preaching to the choir a little bit here because I bet everybody in the audience knows this, but water is moving from the roots up to the canopy and then to the xylem, and then a lot of photosynthetic product is going to move down through the phloem. And when they start scoring into this tissue, they cut off that roadway, and those materials can't get to the rest of the tree. And on the outside, we have pitch tubes. So we have a couple things going over here. We've got like all these little shot holes that looks like somebody shot it up with a bunch of little BBs. And then we've got these spots with the sticky sap coming out. This is the pitch tube. So this is where the beetle bores into the tree to enter it. And then the trees produce pitch to flush the beetles out. It's sort of like when you get a paper cut and you bleed and you're going to flush any debris out. If the trees have enough resources to produce the pitch, they'll make a pitch tube. The beetles tunnel in, and then when they exit, they'll chew their way out, and that's where we get the shot hole appearance. But sometimes we get to the trees and we don't see evidence of pitch tubes, and that's just because that tree was really having a hard time when this all started. A successful pitch tube will flush out the beetle. And if only 1 or 2 beetles attack a tree, that's fine. But when they start getting attacked by dozens and hundreds of beetles, the tree doesn't have the ability to flush all of them out. And then we have successful colonization and the tree begins going downhill. Next, we have southern pine beetle. Again, all these are native pests. And southern pine beetle on a normal day is out in the woods having low-level attacks to stress trees. You know, they're here and there, but they're not outbreaking. But they can have outbreaks where they start to behave on the landscape in epidemic proportions. And when the outbreak gets going, even healthy trees get attacked. And that's where we really start having a problem. Somebody can manage to keep their pine stands healthy. Somebody can manage their yard to keep their trees healthy by treating their trees the right way. But whenever an epidemic gets going and it's moving as a mass across the landscape and healthy trees are getting attacked, there's really relatively few things that can happen. Spots can extend up to 50 feet a day, and they can infest thousands of acres at a time. And sometimes these spots go for over a year. We've got 6 to 7 generations a year, so they're just going to keep cycling through this for the year. So here's the adult. Again, we're not going to see the adult beetles very often unless we're digging in the tree. And green needles on the ground. When I first came to Georgia and started working with pines and limes and moved away from the hemlock trees in Tennessee and came down and had to learn about all the bark beetles, Chip Bates, who was the forest health lead with the Forestry Commission at the time, took me out to my first SPB spot. If you have not been to an SPB spot, I really encourage you to go. It is a great educational opportunity. There's so much going on in that stand. But you walk out and you're looking up at the trees, and he stopped me and he's like, "Elizabeth, look down." I'm like, "There's green needles on the ground." And we don't typically see this. Usually the stands will, like the tree is going to slowly start fading, or sometimes pretty quickly, but it's not dropping green needles. But we do see this with SPB spots. Here is the adult SPB for a size perspective. So they're pretty small. And here is an adult that has been flushed out by a pitch tube. So again, this is a successful pitch tube. What was supposed to happen happened here. The tree just can't do it 1,000 times. The distinctive characteristic for SPB when I'm looking on the outside of a tree is that the pitch tubes tend to be in bark crevices. And so this is very diagnostic. If you walk up to a tree, there's going to be, you can have pitch tubes all kinds of places, but when they're predominantly in the bark crevices, it's time to start thinking, you know, I might have southern pine beetle here. And for reference, we'll look at the ips, which tend to be on the face plates of the bark. Also note the color difference. A lot of times with ips, they can be lighter colored, but a lot of times they have a bit more color in them. They'll pick up this like reddish tint. And I attribute to the tree just having less pitch to give. And so the pitch tubes will be, you know, about the size of a small piece of popcorn. And then if we take our hatchet or whatever you're using to whack into the tree, I'm not cutting trees down, so I get safety glasses and I get a hatchet and I start knocking the bark off of trees. And you flip it over and look down at that inner bark. This is what an SPB pitch tube gallery looks like. So it doesn't look nice and a little more organized like the ips. It just looks like it's going all over the place, like you've seen on the movies where somebody has too much to drink and they get in the tractor and they start driving all over the cornfield and making a mess. And I know that's a crazy way to talk about it, but like, you'll remember it. It's just random, like randomly driving a tractor and knocking down the corn. And so we'll look for those galleries, and then we'll also look for the pitch tubes and bark crevices. And this is what an SPB spot looks like. So we're seeing this progression across the landscape of these skeletons. So it looks gray in the middle. The needles have all fallen off and we just have tree skeletons. And then the red, we're picking up that orangish red. Those are the canopies that are fully dead and the leaves are dropping. And then we have this margin here that is yellow. These trees are beginning to have their canopy decline. And then this is the leading edge. So SPB tends to move across the landscape with a certain direction. That infestation has a head, and that head goes across the landscape. Sometimes it can have multiple ones, and we'll see them tracking off in different directions. We'll see this progression. And if it's a forest stand, we'll manage SPB by coming in here and cutting a leading edge of uninfested trees. So it'll be about the length of your tallest tree and maybe a length and a half of your tallest tree, and to cut out that infestation. And the reason we take uninfested trees is because they're really building up on that pheromone and the distress signals of the pine trees, a lot of chemicals going on, and we want to disrupt that pheromones plume, let it dissipate. And that's how we stop SPB infestation. Sometimes people can't do it. They can't get crews out fast enough. They can't get trees to the mill. So if possible, this is how they want to manage it. If you have a landowner contact you and they suspect that they have SPB in the forest setting, the best thing to do is to direct them to GFC, unless you're in a position where you're taking out trees on that scale. Please direct them to their local county forester, because GFC does have resources that can help with cost share. But like I said, we are having some epic level infestations, or more than we've seen in a few decades. And so Georgia Forestry Commission, as well as other state forestry agencies, cooperate with the Forest Service to do beetle trapping. They trap beetles in the spring, and that helps them develop prediction maps to let landowners know where do we suspect that we might be having more infestations coming up. So this is Georgia for 2024. They deployed 62 traps throughout the state. 52% were positive with southern pine beetle. They collected 91,000 southern pine beetles in their trapping. And so the darker the county, the higher the hazard. So if you're wondering, do I have a lot of southern pine beetle where I am? Here we go. If you're up in this area, you're in a pretty high risk area. So you're probably already seeing it, and I may be telling you things that you already know about southern pine beetle this year. This is what it looked like in 2023. So this is from the Georgia Aerial Survey, where they go and they do flights over to see if there are spots. They georeference them and then go ground truth them and contact the landowner and try to assist them. So IPS is in yellow, southern pine beetle is red, and black turpentine is in blue. Typically, when we see this map, there are a lot of yellow IPS spots and very few red southern pine beetle spots. But this flipped in 2023, and we started to see, we had 273 SPB spots that were confirmed in 2023. So it was starting to ramp up. Then we get to 2024, and I was in April doing some trainings with GFC and their foresters, and they're showing me, okay, it's ramping up again. So we started an outreach effort between the Forestry Commission and UGA to spread the word to landowners, and county agents and foresters and arborists. And so in April, we had 47 southern pine beetle spots. That increased in the beginning of September to over 500 confirmed spots. And this was as of about 2 months ago, we had 1,600 spots in the state. And we have not seen this in a long time, definitely before I was doing forest entomology. Oh, and so let's just have a hurricane march right up through this area. And now we have the overlap of southern pine beetle and a hurricane damage. And we don't exactly know what that's going to look like. Remember, they're working by pheromone and getting this heavy pheromone concentration and tree distress signals. So we're having more stress trees on the environment because of this. But a lot of those stands where a lot of the trees have been taken out, that's not really where I'm thinking it will be the highest risk. I think it's going to be those stands that have some moderate, low to moderate damage. Those are the ones that I would worry about. or residential areas where they didn't have too many trees down, but they did have fairly high wind levels. I think those might be where we start to see some problems, but we don't quite know what that's going to look like. And if you're looking at this track, this is not exact. This was where they predicted the risk of damage. So GFC personnel feel like we should move that. They're about 30 miles east. So picture this going over this way just a little bit. And we may have black turpentine beetles. These guys hit the lower 12 feet of the trunk and they cause scattered pine mortality. Their tunnels don't branch out to the degree that the other bark beetles do. So trees can withstand a black turpentine infestation for a couple of years. And as long as it's not a really heavy infestation or it's getting hit over and over and over again, it's not as likely to kill pine trees. These have only 3 generations a year. And again, they're secondary. They're like, if we have it, why do we have it? What's going on? So here's a picture of the beetle and then a picture of their gallery. So they feed more in a cluster. And these are the pitch tubes. These are the big ones. And I know y'all have seen these. They stick out about 1.5 inches and they look like somebody chewed up a bunch of juicy fruit and then made a volcano with it. And these are very sticky and nasty. And if you ever touch them, you're just like never going to get the mess off your hands. And lastly, we have round-headed wood borers, monocamus, cerambycids. These are longhorn beetles known as pine sawyers. So when someone says, I hear the beetles chewing in the trees, the bark beetles are chewing my tree up, it's not the bark beetles, it is the pine sawyers. These guys have a longer life cycle. They're going to eventually tunnel into the heartwood and sapwood of the tree. And again, they're secondary. They're attacking weakened and dying trees. So we've got the oviposition scar, which is this little football-shaped scar that they chew into the trunk of the tree. It is not a good sign. And when I show you pictures of the galleries, which many of you have seen, it's understandable that when you start to see these signs on a tree, that the tree really is not, it's on its way out. Here's an adult. And then this is a very mature larva. So like I said, I take hatchets to trees on the Tipton campus and I start knocking the bark off. And so here are some big bark plates that we pulled off of a tree about 1.5 years ago. And there's a lot going on right here. We've got galleries for 6-spined ips, galleries for 5-spined ips, as well as pine sawyers. And so if we step up a little bit closer, even in this tiny little piece of bark that's like that, there are galleries for 3 different bark beetles all in this one place. So we've got the 6-spine that's branching out in that nice calligraphy looking pattern, the 5-spine galleries, which are not quite as pretty, and then the pine sawyer tunnels. And look how big those are. Those are just, they'll just eat through all the other tunnels. And sometimes by the time you get to the tree, the homeowner wants to know like what happened, what killed it, and you've got pine sawyer galleries in it, and you know, like some other bark beetles probably got there first. But again, what caused the tree to die? It was very likely a combination of factors. And then again, we've got the engraver beetle feeding in the gallery. As a reminder, southern pine beetle compared to one of the engraver beetles. And then this is pine sawyer galleries that are chewing all over this pine sawyer is chewing all over southern pine beetles. So you can see some of the southern pine beetles in here. And like, are they predators of SPB? Yeah, they are. And you'll get to, well, could it be biocontrol? Well, I mean, it might knock some of the southern pine beetle out, but by the time that we've got something making these massive galleries through the tree, it might take out a few southern pine beetle, but it's also tearing the tree up. So that's who we might see, that's who to look out for, and that is relevant whether you're in a hurricane damaged area, if you're in an SPB spot, if you have southern pine beetle, a lot of times you get evidence of all the other beetles coming in as well. And then after Hurricane Michael, so we'll kind of switch back to hurricanes, we did a study looking at bark beetles and pine sawyers in hurricane impacted stands. We were not able to do as much of it with this study as we wanted to due to COVID. So that it really limited our ability to travel. So the study was only limited to trapping results. We had to scrap some of the stand observation parts of it. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to get some of those answers after Helene. We sampled bark and wood boring beetles and stands with low to high damage, and that was in the summers of 2019. So Michael was in the fall of 18. So we're moving into the summer of 19. So that timing comes up, right? So we get through winter and spring, and that tissue is laying on the ground and it's drying up, and it is not suitable habitat. And we get to the first summer, and then we sampled bark beetles that first summer and got just so many bark beetles. And then we sampled pine sawyers both summers 19 and 20. So this was for 20 and 31-year-old slash and loblolly stands in the Florida Panhandle that were thinned a year or two before the hurricane. We established the plot 6 months after the hurricane. We had intended to go in 2020 and start doing the damage ratings and do those kind of on the ground things, but we could not travel due to the hurricane, due to the pandemic. And our damage categories were low. This is the 20% loss. This is we're just going to leave it and see what happens. And we're grateful that we didn't have more stand damage. Moderate is 30 to 40% loss, getting in the area of time to start really thinking about some decisions for the stand, and even into the high category. But these are pretty high loss, and if it's up around 70%, that there's not a whole lot to salvage with that stand. Usually people at 70% damage are going to do a replant if they can. One of the other issues that come up is everybody wants their stand salvaged, but there is a limitation on logging crews, a limitation on transportation, actually being able to get the trees to the mill, and then limitations on what the mills will take because they get flooded. So it's a little bit more difficult than just saying, oh, this should be salvaged or this should be not, because sometimes the logistics are just not in place. But the goal of this project was to provide insight for operational salvaging decisions. So, we're concerned with the dead wood on the side, if we would see buildup of beetle populations, and the trapping would tell us that, and to help people make some decisions in there. We started to tease at it with this study, but we did not get everything that we would have wanted to get. So some of these answers we still don't have, unfortunately. We collected 3,800 wood-boring beetles. 98% of them were cerambycids, so our longhorn beetles, and then 2% were buprestids. Those are going to be the ones, buprestids are like emerald ash borer. It's just a different family of beetles that bore into wood. And these are all native, none of these are invasive. And there were more species in high damage stands. There's numerous different cerambycid species that we see. And so more species were in the stands that had higher damage. 50 to 60% more wood borers were trapped in the moderately damaged stands. So this seemed to be kind of a sweet spot where we saw more activity the first year. The second year we had to drop this category because some of them got logged, and so now we're just looking at low and high categories. But we did still see it in our second year, a 28% increase in the numbers of beetles caught. And that makes sense, right? That tree material has been sitting there, it's been sitting dead. These beetles have a 1 or 2 year life cycle. They're feeding on that dead wood. They're able to go deeper into the tree and complete their life cycle on that dead wood. And so this is not at all surprising. And what that might mean for stress trees around these areas if we're seeing higher beetle loads. So this is interesting, and this would have been great to pair with on the ground assessments, and hopefully we'll be able to do that in the future. But more activity at certain damage levels, and this plays out in a way that makes sense with what the resources that are on the ground. And then the bark beetle study, and this is Seth Spinner. He was the master's student on the project and did a fantastic job. We collected 224,139 Ips beetles, and Seth went through and identified that. We ended up having to do subsampling because and that's part of the reason we did not extend into a second year. We also collected 3,000 root feeding weevils. Most of that was Paley's weevil. But we did not see a difference in the amount of beetles among the damaged categories, where we were expecting maybe we would see more beetles in this high damage category or the moderate, and maybe there's something there, but we didn't quite get that. So we don't quite know what that's going to look like. All right, so that we're starting to tease at those answers. We're trying to get the answers, and I anticipate, a couple of years from now, if I present it to you, I would come with more answers in hand. So what does that mean for, think about how we can draw implications for maybe the landowner where they have a lot of damage around them and they're wondering if they should get their trees removed. Then I reached out to Georgia Forestry Commission, and Mark McClure is their forest health specialist in the Albany area. He covered that part of the state. And so after Helene, I'm like, okay, Mark, what did you see? Let's get some perspective here. And he noted that there was IPS activity on damaged trees very soon after the hurricane, which we expect. And then for about 2 years, he felt like IPS activity was higher in those damaged areas, sometimes a little bit longer. And this is anecdotal, so we want to get more answers there. He noted that a tree might look pretty good, but would be dying for a couple of years, and it was that very slow decline. So something inside the tree is going on, and we don't probably twisting, and Kim Coder's probably giving y'all talks about the twisting damage in trees. And so they would consider to see some scattered die out. And he said that he did not receive any calls about hurricane-associated disease issues. And then Jeffrey Eichhorn with the Florida Forest Service was involved, and they had some initial damage estimates, sort of like we did with Helene, based on mapping that were low in detail and confidence, but it let them know where to go to look for problems. And so we see Michael's track going from Florida into Georgia, and they established damage categories that were consistent with Georgia, and then did surveying to help tell a coherent story based just on their observations. So in early summer 2019, so we're about 6 or so months after the hurricane, they started seeing widespread pine mortality with IPS in trees that had initially survived the storm but were stressed. And so you see this aerial photo, and there's an ag field and probably a riparian area with a buffer of trees, and they're getting wind damage right along those edges. And he said there's hidden damage and stem and roots from the winds in trees that bent rather than broke. The younger trees often were a problem. These trees were flexible and they were more bendy and had that bending damage. They'd often see resin bleeding from the stem and these resin-soaked tissues, and that indicated there was mechanical injury prior to when the beetles came in. They primarily saw IPS grandicalis and calligraphus, and in our UGA study, we found about 51,000 of these and 187,000 of the calligraphus. They saw higher trap catches in 2019. They had baseline data to compare it to, so they're able to see their trap catches jump up, and then it dropped dramatically in 2020, and then by 2021, it was near background levels. So what this indicates is that, we're going to have an issue for a little while. We want to look at those trees and keep an eye on them pretty routinely. But we don't expect this to be something that goes on for years and years and years. We may see some wider scale damage to trees that are susceptible, but I don't think it's just going to be like a total tear down. And then disease, we don't expect disease issues in 2024. And that's based on what we saw in Michael, but keep an eye out for pitch canker and heterobasidian root disease. And that's because these are diseases that are caused by spores landing on damaged trees. And so when you have more damaged trees in the environment, there's a higher risk for those things. So pitch canker, and I've had this all over my yard. I still have a couple pitch canker trees in my yard. The last big outbreak was in 2004 following multiple smaller hurricanes. So it has been observed with hurricanes in the past. And what happens is the fungal spores land on wounded tree tissues. And typically 10 to 20 or so year trees that have not, plantations that have not been thinned to have the most damage. in the forestry perspective. We see a couple of different things with pitch canker. In younger trees, in either of the trees, we'll see copious pitch flow. So just lots of pitch coming out. You're probably seeing that right now. That wood is just soaked with pitch, and the xylem tissue is filled with resins. The needles from the infested shoots are going to turn yellow and then fade to reddish brown. And on some of the smaller trees, it's easy to see the matted up, sticky needles. So this is something that's a little bit more apparent and easy to see on smaller trees. In trees that are larger, there can be annual cankers that cause dieback. In younger trees, it's more of a mortality issue. The cankers can be on trunks and large limbs, and those are perennial. Like I said, those are the ones that we see in yards that may make the trees more susceptible to breakage, but they're just going to hang out there. They've grown with the tree. In younger trees, that's where we get reduced growth, form loss. In the younger trees, but not baby trees, we start to see that in the upper portion of the crown. And if it spreads to more than half of the crown, the tree is probably going to die. And then another diagnostic characteristic is called a shepherd's crook. And so up in the canopy, look for this crooking of those stems. And that just has to do with the moisture and it causing the tips to curve. And then heterobrachidian root disease. This is more of a forestry issue where air-blown spores from the conchs, the fruiting structures at the base of the tree, will spread to other trees. It usually has a lot to do with when logging occurs, and a lot of this is forest management stuff, but because we have a lot of damaged trees on the landscape, the risk for this will go up. And so the cut stumps, if it were a forestry thing, but it can also be damaged trees, can spread this to adjacent healthy trees by root grafts. And this is going to be one of our more diagnostic characteristics. And this one's a little bit hard for me because I'm used to trees really getting wiped out pretty fast, but this is a slow disease. It starts with lack of vigor, some shortened needles, heavy cone production when the canopy is just loaded up with cones. And then if you take like a little pitch axe and hit around the roots and pull it off, they're going to be stringy and decaying. But again, it's a slow decline. It's not fast. And then we have a hazard map, which this hazard map does have some red overlap with that track where we expect higher risk. So what to do, observe your stands. And many of y'all don't have forestry stands, so it's not that you're going out observing stands, but be mindful that you may get increased calls depending on where you're located. If you get calls and it's southern pine beetle, the tree is not coming back, just cut it down. If it's ips, the tree's probably not cutting back. I do not recommend contact insecticide for ips. And I only recommend one systemic product as a preventative for uninfested trees that are adjacent to infested trees. And I'll be glad to ask more questions, answer questions about that if you have it. Look for those changes in canopy color and then make informed management decisions. Y'all are the professionals, so y'all won't be getting professional assistance. But if it's a friend or a colleague that has forestry land, please point them to GFC or forestry consultants. Final thoughts. We haven't had a lot of storms with this level of timber damage. So we're really, there was Michael and then there's this, so we're waiting to see what happens. We don't have the specific answers for bark beetles that we wish that we had. There hasn't been as much opportunity. And when we did have Michael, we also had COVID disrupting research. So we expect that IPS will be the biggest problem here and that things would settle down within a couple of years. Southern pine beetle is very relevant right now throughout the state, but especially given the outbreak locations and that overlap. And I'm not catastrophizing that. We just don't quite know what that's going to look like. And then lastly, where to get information. The Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources has an outreach page. It's warnelloutreach.org. And if you go to topics, there's community forestry. This is the insects and disease portions, and there's all kinds of information that the outreach faculty has made for the public. We do have a specific outreach publication we wrote after Michael. about bark and wood boring beetles and pine stands and what we might expect. And then the Georgia Forestry Commission Forest Health Program has a lot of information. And so those are the references for some of the studies that we've cited. And I'll be glad to take any questions. And I would like to credit the Forestry Commission. Paul McDaniel is their new Forest Health Coordinator, and they've been great about interacting over these issues.
Just a question on clarification, or repeating something that you mentioned. What was the preventative that you recommended for uninfested trees?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So sometimes we get landowners who want arborists to just go spray something on the tree. People just really want to spray something that makes them feel better. We do not have good guidance for spraying contact insecticides for bark beetles in the Southeast. And sometimes people will go out west and look at something they're doing with mountain pine beetle and then want to bring it out here. And we're dealing with totally different insects and totally different weather conditions. So just first of all, I don't recommend contact insecticide sprays except for maybe limited use with black turpentine. And that's just because they're growing lower down on the tree. For systemic insecticides, those are ones that most of y'all know, you apply it to the root or to the trunk and it gets incorporated into tree tissues. And those chemicals don't all move very well inside the tree, especially between xylem and phloem. So things like imidacloprid and dinotefuran, I do not recommend for bark beetles. Emamectin benzoate is recommended for bark beetles, but only in uninfested trees as a preventative, and that is based on the training that I got from ArborJet when I got my injector. So I do inject trees when it comes up for research. I do use emamectin benzoate mostly for emerald ash borer, but for bark beetles, and not southern pine beetle, but more like ips and black turpentine, that's where you've got some really high value trees. And there's Ips tree next to it, and the landowner's worried that they're all maybe having some kind of similar stressor. And it's on the golf course at the entry to the subdivision and where the expense is merited, or just in people who have the resources to put that into their trees. That's not most homeowners.
We do have time for some more questions. So if you do have questions for Dr. McCarty, please feel free to put those in the Q&A now.
There is no Sasquatch behind me in the woods, but thank you for asking. This is a picture that I took in the Smokies when I was out scouting sites a few years ago, and it seemed to work with the fall theme for November. If you look on the Warnell outreach page, we do have information for, we worked with Georgia Forestry Commission a couple of years ago and came out with new emerald ash borer guidance for the state. So if you're dealing with emerald ash borer, there's a resource there for you. And then there's lots of invasive insects to be looking for, like Asian longhorn beetle. We're looking for Asian longhorn beetle in the state. It is in South Carolina. So if you've got somebody that has a dead maple tree with, looks like there's some really big beetles going in there, that might be a great time to reach out to your UGA county agent.
Okay, while you all are thinking about your questions, I'm going to drop the link in the chat for the survey for you to fill out. This is how you receive your CEU if you would like to receive a CEU, or if you'd like to just leave feedback, you can do that as well. So please feel free to fill out that form, and I will submit it to the ISA for a CEU. We do have a question in the Q&A. Would you recommend we report to Georgia Forestry when we find evidence of SBB individual or larger groupings?
Based on the amount now, like sometimes it is good to get a report because that county hasn't been reported as infested yet. It's not going to hurt if you call your county forester and just let them know I mean, they're not gonna run out for every yard tree, but it may be that it hasn't been documented in the county. And sometimes we've gotten our first report for the year from, like county extension agent, and it's in somebody's yard, and it was our first report for like 2019. So it doesn't hurt. I wouldn't call them for every dead tree, but you know, if it's the first one that you've seen, you haven't seen anything like that in the area, it may not hurt. And then just remove the tree before anybody gets hurt.
Is there evidence that regular burning and mechanical thinning helps prevent beetle damage? And if so, is that due to pheromone dispersal?
Yes, and some yes and no. So yes, there's evidence that thinning trees helps prevent beetle damage because that keeps trees healthier. So post World War II, we really started going with the pines and lines. And I'm saying we and things that happened before I was born, but they really started going with pines and lines and growing trees tightly together and didn't necessarily know how to manage it as well as they could have. So trees were not getting thinned, stands were getting overstocked, there was more competition, trees were getting stressed. And then, you know, what the 70s, 80s, we had a ton of bark beetle, southern pine beetle infestations. And then through research between universities and the Forest Service, they learned that really thinning those trees out helped. And it helps for a couple of reasons. It helps with pheromone dispersal. And I go into more details in another bark beetle talk I give about the pheromone dispersal, but thinning the stands and doing good vegetation control, if it's mechanical or chemical, reduces the competition on the trees, and the trees are healthier and less susceptible. And then it also opens up that understory and allows more wind to go through, and it allows that pheromone to disperse better. So it's due to really to both things.
Why does the fungal root disease mentioned seem to have a higher occurrence along the fall line in Georgia?
It does have a higher occurrence on the fall line. I think that has a lot. I'm not 100% sure on that one, but I think it's highly soil driven.
All right, last call for questions. Give it one more minute. Again, the CEO, we got another question. If we need to PCT a stand due to excessive natural regeneration of volunteer pines in a pine plantation, either by hack and squirt or felling and leaving trees on the ground, are you worried about beetle outbreaks during the next growing season?
Not usually, if everything else is okay. Not usually. I mean, I think that if there are other trees around them are healthy, they're less susceptible. And anytime that you go in there and manage, you could potentially increase stress on the stand, but also if you don't go in there and manage, then the stress on the stand will go up as well.
Receiving many thanks. And I'd also like to say thank you, Dr. McCarty. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. I hope that everyone gained some insight in this presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you again. Hopefully next time, not such devastating experience for all of us. So we really appreciate you, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you for your time tonight.
Have a great evening, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon. Make sure you fill out the form to get your CEU, and I will see you all soon. Thank you.